The day the boundary was set. She didn't plan to say it that day. Most people don't. Boundaries are rarely dramatic decisions made in moments of clarity. They slip out in moments of exhaustion, when your body is already tired of carrying what your mind has been trying to justify for years. Emily had spent weeks telling herself that this time would be different, that if she chose the right words, the right tone, the right moment, the conversation would finally land. She told herself that if she stayed calm enough, patient enough, loving enough, nothing would explode. But that afternoon, sitting across from Daniel in a quiet cafe near the river, something inside her went still. Not calm, not peaceful. Still. The kind of stillness that arrives when your nervous system gives up negotiating. He was talking, complaining, really, about how people had been disrespectful lately, how no one appreciated his effort, how everyone seemed to misunderstand him. Emily nodded automatically, the way she always did, even though she could already feel the familiar tightness forming behind her eyes. Then it happened. He interrupted her mid-sentence. Again. Corrected her memory. Again. Smiled in that subtle way that made her feel small without ever raising his voice. And suddenly, without rehearsing it, without softening it, without cushioning it with apologies, she said, "I'm not okay with being spoken to like that. I need some space right now." The words landed softly. Too softly, maybe. There was no shouting, no slammed table, no dramatic exit, just silence. Daniel leaned back, tilted his head, and smiled, not warmly, not kindly, but with something unreadable behind his eyes. "So now I'm the bad guy," he said. "Interesting." That was the moment Emily felt it. Not anger, not relief. Guilt. Instant, sharp, overwhelming guilt. Her chest tightened. Her thoughts raced. She replayed the sentence in her head, already editing it, already wondering if she should take it back. Maybe she sounded harsh. Maybe she overreacted. Maybe she should explain more. Maybe she should reassure him that she wasn't leaving, that she still cared, that she wasn't trying to hurt him. This is the part no one talks about. The first boundary doesn't feel powerful, it feels dangerous. Your body reacts as if you've done something wrong, even when your mind knows you haven't. You feel exposed, as if you've broken an unspoken rule that everyone else seems to understand but you. Emily didn't realize it yet, but that sentence didn't threaten the relationship. It threatened the illusion holding it together. For years, she had been accommodating without realizing it, adjusting her tone, explaining her emotions carefully, anticipating reactions before they happened, avoiding topics that led to tension. Convincing herself that this was what emotional maturity looked like. She called it love. But what she had really been doing was shrinking. And the moment she stopped shrinking, even just a little, the dynamic shifted. That's why things got strange after that day. Not immediately, not obviously. At first, Daniel became quiet, distant, cold in a way that felt deliberate. Conversations felt rehearsed. Texts grew shorter. Affection felt conditional, like it had to be earned again. Then came the comments. "You've changed. You're so sensitive lately. I don't know what happened to you." Each sentence landed like a question she was expected to answer. A test she didn't realize she was taking. Emily started doubting herself. Was she being selfish? Was this boundary necessary? Or was she sabotaging something that could have been fixed if she just tried harder? Here's the uncomfortable truth most people never hear. When a boundary causes chaos, it's not because the boundary is wrong. It's because the relationship was built on your lack of one. Healthy people don't experience boundaries as threats. They experience them as information. They may feel disappointed, even frustrated, but they don't feel erased by them. Narcissistic dynamics are different. A boundary doesn't register as a preference or a need. It registers as loss of control. What Emily couldn't see yet was that Daniel hadn't heard, "I need space." What he heard was, "You no longer have unrestricted access to me." And for someone whose sense of stability depends on access, influence, and emotional leverage, that feels unbearable. This is why boundaries don't lead to conversations in narcissistic relationships. They lead to reactions, confusion, guilt, subtle punishment, emotional withdrawal, suddenly rewritten histories where you become the problem for having limits at all. And here's the most disorienting part. Nothing about the boundary itself was extreme. Emily didn't yell. She didn't accuse. She didn't threaten to leave. She simply named her limit, and yet it felt like she had detonated something. That's because boundaries don't create dysfunction. They expose it. They reveal where connection ends and control begins. They illuminate dynamics that survive only when one person absorbs the emotional cost for two. In the days that followed, Emily found herself replaying that moment again and again. The look on his face, the pause before he spoke, the way the air seemed to change in the room. She wondered whether she could have said it differently, kinder, softer, more carefully. But deep down, beneath the doubt, there was something else. A quiet awareness she couldn't unfeel. For the first time, she had chosen herself without asking permission. And once you do that, even once, you can't unknow it. If you've ever set a boundary and immediately felt like you were the villain, if you've ever watched someone become colder, angrier, or more manipulative the moment you stopped over-explaining yourself, if you've ever wondered why doing something healthy made everything feel worse instead of better, this story isn't just Emily's. And the reaction you witnessed wasn't random. In the rest of this video, we're going to break down exactly why narcissists hate boundaries. Not in a sensational way, not to label or demonize, but to help you understand what's actually happening beneath the surface. So you stop blaming yourself for reactions that were never about you in the first place. Before we continue, if this kind of deep, honest breakdown resonates with you, make sure to subscribe to the channel. It's the best way to support the work here and helps us keep creating thoughtful, psychology-based content that actually helps people make sense of difficult relationships. Now, Troyes, a quick question for you. Answer in the comments. A. When someone reacts badly to your boundary, does that mean you set it wrong? B. Or does it mean the boundary revealed something they didn't want to face? Comment A or B below what a boundary really is and why healthy people respect it. A boundary is one of the most misunderstood concepts in human relationships. People talk about boundaries as if they are weapons, ultimatums, or emotional shutdowns. They imagine slammed doors, rigid rules, cold distance. They assume that if a boundary is needed, something must already be broken. And if a boundary upsets someone else, then surely it must have been done wrong. But a real boundary isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with drama. Most of the time, it doesn't even arrive with confidence. A boundary is simply the moment someone stops abandoning themselves. That's it. Nothing more philosophical, nothing cruel, nothing extreme. For Emily, the word boundary didn't exist in her vocabulary for a long time. She didn't grow up thinking in terms of limits. She grew up thinking in terms of harmony, being easy, being flexible, being someone others felt comfortable around. She learned early that love often came with an unspoken condition. Don't make things difficult. So when people talk about boundaries like they are obvious natural skills, they forget how deeply unfamiliar they can feel to someone who has learned to survive by adapting. A boundary is not a demand that someone else change. It is not an attempt to control behavior. It is not a punishment for wrongdoing. A boundary is information. It is the clearest, most honest signal a person can give about where they end and where another person begins. I'm not comfortable with that. I need time before responding. I won't continue this conversation if it turns disrespectful. These statements are not threats, they are coordinates. They tell others how to stay connected without causing harm. Healthy people understand this instinctively, even if they don't like it at first. They might feel disappointed, they might feel frustrated, they might even feel hurt. But something crucial happens inside a healthy nervous system. It adjusts, it recalibrates, it recognizes that another person's limits are not a rejection of the relationship itself. This is one of the clearest distinctions between healthy relational dynamics and unhealthy ones. In a healthy dynamic, a boundary creates clarity. In an unhealthy dynamic, a boundary creates panic. Most people don't realize how many boundaries they already use every day. You don't answer your phone during a meeting. You lock your door at night. You decide which parts of your life belong to coworkers and which belong to close friends. You choose when to rest, when to engage, when to step away. None of this feels selfish, because boundaries are not about withholding love. They are about preserving capacity. Without boundaries, connection doesn't deepen. It erodes. Emily began to understand this slowly, not through theory, but through contrast. She noticed how different people reacted when she expressed even the smallest limit. When she told a colleague she couldn't stay late, the colleague adjusted. When she told a friend she needed a quiet weekend, the friend understood. But when she tried to apply that same honesty with Daniel, everything changed. That difference mattered. Healthy people may feel disappointed by a boundary, but they do not feel threatened by it. Their sense of self does not depend on unrestricted access to another person. They don't interpret limits as abandonment. They don't hear no as a personal attack. This is because healthy connection allows for separateness. Two people can be close without being fused. They can care deeply without needing constant reassurance. They can tolerate discomfort without trying to erase it. Boundaries thrive in that space. What often confuses people is the emotional discomfort that comes with setting a boundary. They assume discomfort means danger. They assume guilt means wrongdoing. They assume anxiety means something has gone wrong. But discomfort is not the same as harm. Emily felt uncomfortable after setting her boundary, not because it was wrong, but because it was unfamiliar. Her nervous system had been trained to prioritize connection at the expense of self-definition. The moment she chose clarity over appeasement, her body reacted as if she had broken a rule. This is where many people retreat. They feel the guilt and decide the boundary was a mistake. They rush to explain, to soften, to undo it. They say things they don't mean just to restore emotional equilibrium. But that equilibrium was never neutral, it was simply familiar. A boundary challenges familiar dynamics. It interrupts patterns that relied on one person over-functioning emotionally. It removes ambiguity, and ambiguity is often what keeps unhealthy relationships comfortable. In healthy relationships, ambiguity isn't required for closeness. Honesty strengthens the bond. In unhealthy ones, ambiguity protects imbalance. That's why boundaries feel so disruptive in certain dynamics. They remove the fog. They clarify roles. They expose expectations that were never spoken aloud. For Emily, the deeper realization was this: she had been equating love with accessibility. She believed that being available at all times was proof of care. That explaining herself endlessly was a sign of emotional maturity. That tolerating discomfort silently made her strong. But strength without boundaries is not strength. It is endurance. And endurance, when it becomes a requirement for love, slowly empties a person out. Healthy people don't need you to disappear in order to feel secure. They don't require constant emotional availability to trust connection. They don't punish you for having needs. They respect boundaries because boundaries make relationships sustainable. This doesn't mean healthy people never struggle with limits. It means they take responsibility for their reaction instead of outsourcing it. They feel their disappointment without turning it into accusation. They adapt rather than escalate. That adaptation is the key difference. When Emily stopped over-explaining herself, she noticed something subtle but profound. In healthy interactions, less explanation actually created more respect. Her words carried weight. Her time felt intentional. Her presence felt chosen rather than extracted. Boundaries didn't push people away. They refined who could stay close. And this is the part that often gets lost in boundary conversations. Boundaries are not about distance. They are about discernment. They don't say, "You don't matter." They say, "This is how I stay whole while staying connected." The reason this distinction matters so much is because narcissistic dynamics blur it intentionally. They frame boundaries as cruelty, as withdrawal, as emotional abandonment. They teach you to associate self-definition with harm. But in reality, boundaries are the most pro-relationship tool a person has. They protect intimacy from resentment. They prevent closeness from becoming obligation. They keep love from turning into self-erasure. Emily began to understand that boundaries were not something she owed an explanation for. They were something she owed herself. And that understanding changed the question she asked herself. Instead of asking, "Is this boundary fair to them?" she began asking, "Is this boundary necessary for me?" That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Because healthy people don't ask you to disappear to keep them comfortable. They meet you where you are. They respect where you end. And they understand that a relationship without boundaries is not intimacy. It's control wearing the mask of closeness. Inside the narcissistic mind, when a boundary appears in a narcissistic dynamic, what happens on the surface is rarely what's actually happening underneath. Outwardly, it may look like irritation, confusion, or anger. Sometimes it looks like withdrawal, sometimes it looks like mockery or indifference. But internally, something far more destabilizing is taking place. Something that has very little to do with the words of the boundary itself, and everything to do with what that boundary represents. To understand this, you have to stop thinking of narcissism as arrogance. Arrogance is what it looks like. Narcissism at its core is fragility. Daniel did not experience Emily's boundary as a request or a preference. He didn't hear it as, "I need space," or "This doesn't feel okay for me." His mind did not process it as information about her internal world. Instead, it registered as a rupture, a sudden break in a system that had been quietly regulating him for a long time. People often assume narcissists feel powerful because they act dominant, but dominance is not the same as inner stability. In fact, the need to dominate usually signals the opposite. Narcissistic personalities rely heavily on external regulation. Other people's attention, responsiveness, agreement, on emotional availability to maintain a coherent sense of self. This regulation is subtle. It doesn't always look like praise-seeking or obvious control. Often it looks like emotional dependence disguised as closeness, the ability to interrupt, the expectation of immediate replies, the unspoken assumption that their feelings take precedence, the quiet confidence that they can shape the emotional atmosphere of the room. For a long time, Emily had unknowingly been part of that regulatory system. Her explanations helped him feel understood. Her patience helped him feel justified. Her flexibility helped him feel secure. When she set a boundary, that system faltered. And when an external regulation system collapses, the narcissistic psyche doesn't experience disappointment. It experiences threat. A boundary creates separation. And separation, for a narcissistic mind, feels like annihilation. This is where the intensity comes from. This is why the reaction is rarely proportional to the situation. This is why something small, like a request for space or a refusal to engage, can provoke an emotional response that seems wildly outsized, because internally the boundary is not being evaluated logically. It is being felt as loss of control, loss of access, loss of identity. Daniel's sense of stability depended on predictability, on knowing how Emily would respond, on trusting that her emotional energy was available to absorb his frustration, soothe his insecurity, reflect his importance back to him. When that availability was interrupted, even briefly, it created a vacuum, and narcissistic structures do not tolerate vacuums. Where a healthy mind might pause, reflect, or adjust, a narcissistic mind moves quickly to restore equilibrium, by any means necessary, not because of malice, but because of panic. This is why boundaries trigger urgency, the subtle pressure to explain yourself again, the sudden shift in tone, the emotional coldness designed to pull you back in. These are not strategic in the way people imagine. They are reflexive. The boundary destabilizes the narcissist's internal balance, and the psyche scrambles to regain footing. What makes this so confusing for the boundary setter is that the narcissist often appears calm or even amused on the surface. Daniel didn't shout when Emily spoke up. He didn't argue in that moment. He smiled. But that smile wasn't ease. It was defense. Narcissistic defenses are sophisticated. They often involve minimizing the importance of the boundary, reframing it as overreaction, or subtly shifting the narrative so that the focus moves away from the limit itself and onto the character of the person who set it. You're being dramatic. You've changed. I guess I can't do anything right anymore. These responses are not random phrases. They are attempts to destabilize the boundary holder's confidence, because confidence is what keeps a boundary intact. Inside the narcissistic mind, the boundary is not evaluated on its merits. It is evaluated on its impact on control. Does it reduce access? Does it interrupt influence? Does it create unpredictability? If the answer is yes, the boundary is perceived as dangerous. This is also why narcissists often escalate when boundaries are held calmly. Emotional reactions can be exploited. Anger can be used as proof of instability. Tears can be reframed as manipulation. But calm consistency leaves very little to work with. And that calm is deeply unsettling. Because calm suggests autonomy. It suggests that the other person is no longer orienting around the narcissist's emotional state. For someone like Daniel, this feels intolerable. Not because he wants to hurt Emily, but because he cannot regulate himself without her participation. This is the paradox of narcissism. The behavior looks self-centered, but the internal experience is one of profound dependency. The narcissist needs others to remain emotionally open in order to feel intact. Boundaries close that opening, and when that happens, the psyche looks for someone to blame. This is where projection enters. Rather than experiencing the boundary as information about Emily's needs, Daniel's mind reframes it as evidence of her flaw, her coldness, her selfishness, her lack of loyalty. This reframing serves an important internal function. It protects him from confronting the deeper truth, that his stability was never self-generated. Acknowledging that would require vulnerability, and vulnerability for a narcissistic structure feels far more dangerous than anger. This is why you rarely see genuine curiosity after a boundary in narcissistic dynamics. Curiosity requires tolerating uncertainty. It requires staying present with discomfort. It requires accepting that another person's experience exists independently of your own. Boundaries demand exactly that. Healthy people can meet that demand even when it's uncomfortable. Narcissistic minds resist it because separateness threatens the illusion of control that keeps the self from fragmenting. Emily sensed this long before she could articulate it. She noticed how Daniel seemed more unsettled by her calm than he ever had been by her tears. How her refusal to over-explain created more tension than any argument they'd had before. This is not accidental. Boundaries remove the emotional currency narcissists use to regulate themselves. They stop the flow of reassurance, responsiveness, and engagement that once maintained balance. And without that flow, the narcissist is left alone with feelings they don't know how to process. Shame, inadequacy, fear of insignificance. Rather than turning inward, they turn outward. They attempt to re-establish the old dynamic not because it was healthy, but because it was familiar. Familiarity feels safer than growth. This is why boundaries are often met with attempts to rewrite history. Why the relationship suddenly gets framed as never being the same. Why the boundary setter is accused of becoming someone else. From the narcissistic perspective, that accusation feels true. Because the version of you who had no limits is gone. And with it, the illusion that the relationship could continue without change. Understanding this does not excuse the behavior, but it explains why reasoning rarely works, why logic fails, why empathy alone cannot repair the rupture. You are not dealing with disagreement. You are dealing with a destabilized identity, and no amount of reassurance can rebuild an identity that depends on access to someone else. This is the moment where many people feel tempted to soften their boundary, to explain again, to compromise prematurely, to take responsibility for the other person's discomfort. But that discomfort is not caused by cruelty. It is caused by separation, and separation is not harm, it is reality. A boundary does not attack a narcissist. It simply reveals what was already there, a system that functioned only when one person stayed small enough to keep it intact. When you understand what is happening inside the narcissistic mind, something important shifts. You stop trying to convince them. You stop taking the reaction personally. And you begin to see the boundary not as a rupture, but as a moment of truth, one that clarifies what kind of connection is possible and what kind was never sustainable to begin with. Because a relationship that cannot survive your autonomy was never built on mutual respect. It was built on access, and access is exactly what a boundary takes away. The backlash cycle. How narcissists fight boundaries. When a boundary is set in a narcissistic dynamic, the reaction rarely happens all at once. It unfolds in stages, quietly at first, then more intensely, like a system trying desperately to restore its previous balance. This is what makes the backlash so confusing. It doesn't look like a single explosion. It looks like a sequence of emotional maneuvers, each one designed to test whether the boundary will hold. Emily noticed this pattern only in hindsight. In the moment, it felt personal, emotional, chaotic. But over time, she began to see that what she was experiencing wasn't random emotion. It was a cycle. And that cycle exists for one reason: to make the boundary disappear. The first response is almost always subtle, dismissive, minimizing. Daniel didn't argue with her boundary right away. He treated it like a misunderstanding, something too small to take seriously. He acted as though the issue wasn't the behavior she named, but her reaction to it. You're reading into things. You're stressed. That's all this is. I didn't mean it like that. This stage is designed to make the boundary feel unnecessary. If the problem can be reframed as imaginary or exaggerated, then the limit no longer needs to exist. The responsibility shifts quietly back onto the person who set it. Minimization works best when the boundary setter already doubts themselves. Emily felt that doubt immediately. She wondered if she had misinterpreted his tone. If she was being too sensitive, if she should have waited for a better moment. That hesitation is the opening the cycle depends on. If minimization doesn't dissolve the boundary, the next phase emerges: guilt. This is where the emotional tone changes. The boundary is no longer treated as irrelevant but as harmful. "I thought we were closer than this. I wouldn't do that to you. I guess I just care more than you do." Guilt reframes the boundary as a moral failure. It suggests that setting a limit is evidence of coldness, selfishness, or lack of commitment. The message is subtle but powerful. If you really cared, you wouldn't need this boundary. This stage is particularly effective on people who equate love with sacrifice. Emily had spent years being the understanding one, the patient one, the one who tried to see things from every angle. Guilt worked on her because it activated an old fear that prioritizing herself would cost her connection. And still the boundary remained. That's when the cycle escalated. Daniel's tone hardened. Conversations grew tense. Silence replaced engagement. When he did speak, his words were sharper, edged with resentment. The warmth that once felt automatic became conditional. This phase is often misunderstood as anger, but it's more accurate to call it pressure. Withdrawal is not an accident in narcissistic dynamics, it's a tactic. Emotional availability is reduced in order to create discomfort, to remind the other person of what they're risking by holding their ground. The unspoken message is clear: if you keep this boundary, this is what connection will feel like. Emily felt it immediately. The atmosphere changed. She found herself missing the ease they once had, even though she now recognized how much that ease had cost her. And that recognition made the pressure worse, because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. When withdrawal fails to bring the boundary down, the narrative often flips entirely. The narcissist becomes the victim. "You're so distant now. You don't care like you used to. I don't even recognize you anymore." In this stage, the boundary is no longer the issue. The boundary setter's character is, their integrity, their emotional stability. This is where many people break, not because they believe the accusations, but because they don't want to be seen as the villain in their own story. They rush to clarify, to defend themselves, to prove that they're still good, still loving, still safe. But defense feeds the cycle. Every explanation becomes evidence that the boundary is negotiable. Every reassurance teaches the narcissist that persistence works. Emily noticed that the more she tried to explain her intentions, the more Daniel questioned them. The more she emphasized that she wasn't leaving, the more he acted as if she had already abandoned him. This is not misunderstanding, it is leverage seeking. At the final stage of the cycle, the tone shifts again, sometimes dramatically. There may be an apology, a sudden moment of vulnerability, a promise to change, an expression of regret that feels sincere enough to reignite hope. "I didn't realize how much this affected you. I'll do better. I just don't want to lose you." This stage is not always manipulative in the conscious sense. Sometimes the emotion is real. Sometimes the fear is genuine, but the function remains the same: to restore the previous dynamic without requiring real change. The apology often lacks specificity. The promise lacks structure. The accountability lacks follow-through. Because the goal is not growth, it's access. Emily wanted to believe these moments meant progress, that things were finally shifting, that her boundary had been heard. But she began to notice a pattern. Each softening occurred only after the pressure failed. And each time the boundary relaxed, the cycle reset. This is the most exhausting part of the backlash cycle, not the conflict, but the oscillation. Hope followed by tension, relief followed by doubt, closeness followed by control. Over time, the nervous system becomes hypervigilant, always waiting for the next shift, always bracing for the emotional weather to change, and that is the hidden cost of the cycle. It drains clarity. The boundary setter becomes focused on managing reactions rather than honoring needs. They start measuring their words, timing their honesty, calculating the emotional cost of self-expression. This is how boundaries slowly erode, not through force but through fatigue. What makes the backlash cycle so destabilizing is that each stage feels plausible in isolation. Minimization sounds reasonable. Guilt sounds emotional. Withdrawal feels like hurt. Apologies feel hopeful. But together they form a system designed to test one question over and over again. Will you hold the line, or will you disappear to restore peace? Emily's breakthrough came when she stopped analyzing each reaction individually and started observing the pattern as a whole. She realized that no response she offered actually resolved the issue. The boundary itself remained the trigger. That realization was painful, because it meant the conflict wasn't about misunderstanding or communication style. It was about resistance. Resistance to a relationship no longer organized around one person's emotional needs. This is why boundaries often feel like they make things worse before they make anything better. They disrupt a system that relied on imbalance, and systems resist disruption. Understanding the backlash cycle doesn't make it hurt less, but it makes it clearer. It helps you see that the escalation is not proof that you were wrong to set a boundary. It is proof that the boundary mattered. Healthy relationships don't require cycles of punishment to survive discomfort. They don't punish autonomy. They don't demand emotional surrender to maintain closeness. When backlash appears, it's not a sign that you've damaged something healthy. It's a sign that you've interrupted something unhealthy. And once you see the cycle, you face a difficult truth. No amount of explanation will stop it. No perfect wording will neutralize it. No emotional labor will fix it. The only thing that ends the backlash cycle is consistency. Not cruelty, not confrontation, not withdrawal for revenge. Consistency. Holding the boundary without feeding the drama. Allowing the reactions to exist without absorbing responsibility for them. Refusing to negotiate your reality in order to stabilize someone else's emotions. This is where real power begins. Not power over the narcissist, but power over your own participation. Emily didn't end the cycle by winning an argument. She ended it by stepping out of the pattern. And that choice, quiet, steady, unremarkable from the outside, changed everything that followed. Why boundaries feel like abandonment to narcissists. To a healthy mind, a boundary is a line that protects connection. To a narcissistic mind, the very same line feels like abandonment. This is one of the most painful and confusing truths for people like Emily to grasp, because it sounds irrational. She wasn't leaving. She wasn't disappearing. She wasn't withdrawing love. She was still present, still communicating, still invested. All she had done was define a limit. Yet inside Daniel, something entirely different was being experienced. Not disappointment, not frustration. Loss. To understand why boundaries feel like abandonment to narcissists, you have to understand how they experience closeness in the first place. Narcissistic attachment is not built on mutual recognition of two separate people. It is built on emotional fusion. Fusion means the other person is not fully experienced as separate. Their availability, responsiveness, and emotional energy are unconsciously treated as extensions of the narcissist's own inner world. This is not a deliberate belief. It is a developmental wound. In healthy development, a child gradually learns that love can exist alongside separation, that a caregiver can be emotionally present without being constantly available, that frustration does not equal rejection, that boundaries do not mean disappearance. In narcissistic development, this process is disrupted. Instead of internalizing a stable sense of self, the child learns to regulate their emotions externally. Other people become mirrors, stabilizers, buffers against shame and emptiness. Over time, closeness becomes synonymous with access. Unlimited access feels like safety. Any limit feels like loss. So when Emily set her boundary, Daniel did not experience it as a reasonable assertion of selfhood. He experienced it as a withdrawal of emotional oxygen. This is why narcissists often use the language of abandonment, even when no abandonment is occurring. You're pulling away. You're leaving me emotionally. You're shutting me out. These statements are not exaggerations in their inner experience. They are accurate descriptions of how the boundary feels in their body. A boundary interrupts emotional fusion. Fusion is what keeps the narcissistic self intact. Without fusion, the old feelings rush in. Emptiness, worthlessness, fear of being unimportant. These feelings are overwhelming not because they are new, but because they were never learned how to be processed internally. Instead of recognizing these feelings as internal states, the narcissistic mind locates the cause externally. You did this to me. You changed. You made me feel abandoned. This is why boundaries are not negotiated in narcissistic dynamics. They are fought. Because in Daniel's internal world, the boundary is not about behavior. It is about survival. Emily began to notice how quickly his language shifted after she held her ground. The conversation stopped being about the boundary itself and started being about what it supposedly revealed about her. Her loyalty, her empathy, her commitment. This shift is not accidental. It is how the narcissistic mind restores coherence. If the other person can be framed as uncaring, then the pain no longer needs to be examined internally. It becomes justified. Abandonment is one of the most powerful accusations because it activates guilt in the boundary setter, and guilt is the emotion that most reliably collapses boundaries. Emily felt that pull deeply. She did not want to be someone who abandoned others. She valued loyalty. She valued emotional responsibility. The idea that her boundary could be experienced as harm disturbed her. This is the trap, because the narcissistic experience of abandonment is not based on actual withdrawal. It is based on the loss of control over emotional access. When Emily stopped being endlessly available, Daniel lost a source of regulation. When she stopped explaining herself repeatedly, he lost reassurance. When she stopped adjusting herself to maintain his comfort, he lost the illusion that her inner world revolved around his. That loss felt unbearable, so the mind translated it into abandonment. It is important to understand that this reaction is not cured by reassurance. In fact, reassurance often makes it worse. Every time Emily tried to soften the impact by emphasizing that she wasn't leaving, Daniel heard a contradiction. Her words said connection. Her boundary said separation. And separation is what he could not tolerate. This is why narcissists often escalate their claims of abandonment the more calmly a boundary is held. Calmness signals independence. Independence confirms separateness. Separateness intensifies the fear. From the outside, this looks manipulative. From the inside, it feels like panic. That panic often expresses itself as accusation because accusation creates engagement. Engagement restores connection. Even negative attention feels better than emotional distance. Emily noticed that when she stayed neutral, Daniel became more emotionally charged. When she refused to argue, he raised the stakes. When she declined to defend herself, he intensified the narrative. This is not because he wanted conflict. It is because conflict is still connection. A boundary that is held without emotional engagement creates a kind of silence the narcissistic mind cannot interpret as neutral. Silence feels like disappearance, and disappearance feels like abandonment. This is where many people confuse empathy with self-sacrifice. They believe that because the narcissist's pain feels real, the boundary must be wrong. They assume that compassion requires reversal, but compassion does not mean dissolving yourself to regulate someone else. The pain Daniel felt was real, but the cause of that pain was not Emily's boundary. It was the absence of an internal structure that could tolerate separation. This distinction matters because without it, boundaries will always collapse under guilt. Emily eventually realized something that changed how she held her limits. She was not responsible for preventing Daniel from feeling abandoned. She was responsible for being honest about her capacity. Abandonment implies disappearance. Boundaries imply definition. They are not the same. But to a narcissistic mind, they feel identical because both interrupt fusion. This is also why narcissists often accuse others of being cold or emotionally unavailable the moment boundaries appear. Warmth in their internal language means access. Coldness means resistance. Emily saw this clearly when she compared Daniel's reactions to those of healthier people in her life. Others adjusted. Daniel collapsed inward or lashed outward. The difference was not sensitivity, it was structure. Healthy people have an internal sense of continuity. They can hold on to connection even when access changes. Narcissistic structures cannot. They rely on constant reinforcement. This is why boundaries often provoke desperate attempts to pull the other person back into emotional labor. Long conversations, emotional confessions, crisis moments, anything that reestablishes fusion. And when those attempts fail, the narrative hardens. You abandon me. Not because it's true, but because it protects the narcissist from confronting the deeper wound, the terror of existing without someone else holding them together. Emily didn't stop feeling compassion when she understood this, but her compassion changed. It became quieter, more grounded, less self-erasing. She stopped trying to prove that she wasn't abandoning him. She stopped contorting herself to soothe an experience she didn't cause. She allowed the discomfort to exist without fixing it, and that was the moment the dynamic truly shifted. Because a boundary that survives guilt is a boundary that reveals reality. It reveals whether the connection can tolerate two whole people, or whether it was built on one person disappearing so the other could feel safe. Boundaries do not create abandonment. They reveal who was relying on you not having a self, and that truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. Holding the line, how to keep boundaries without losing yourself. Holding a boundary over time is one of the most psychologically demanding acts a person can perform, especially when the relationship has been organized around you being the flexible one, the understanding one, the one who absorbs discomfort so others don't have to. For Emily, the real challenge didn't come when she first spoke the boundary. It came in the days and weeks after, when the emotional gravity of the old dynamic tried to pull her back into orbit. Because boundaries don't just change behavior, they change identity. When you stop accommodating, you stop being recognizable to the version of yourself that survived by adapting. Emily began to notice how unfamiliar she felt to herself. The urge to explain rose constantly. The impulse to check in, to smooth things over, to soften the edges of her words pressed against her chest like muscle memory. These impulses didn't mean she was wrong. They meant she was unlearning something deeply ingrained. For years, her sense of worth had been quietly tied to how easy she was to be with, how available, how reasonable. Holding a boundary threatened that self-concept. If she wasn't the one who made things easier, then who was she? This is where many people lose themselves, not by crossing their own boundaries, but by defining themselves entirely through them. They become rigid, defensive, constantly braced. That's not what holding the line means. Holding the line is not about becoming hard. It's about becoming anchored. Emily learned that the most important boundary was not the one she set with Daniel, but the one she set within herself. The boundary between responsibility and over-responsibility. She was responsible for being honest. She was responsible for being respectful. She was responsible for acting with integrity. She was not responsible for managing Daniel's emotional response to her honesty. That distinction sounds simple, but living it requires emotional stamina. Every time Daniel reacted with tension or accusation, Emily had to resist the reflex to overfunction. She had to allow discomfort to exist without rushing to resolve it. This is where many people confuse boundaries with emotional withdrawal. But Emily wasn't withdrawing. She was still present. She still listened. She still spoke kindly. What she stopped doing was negotiating her reality to stabilize someone else. Holding the line meant tolerating the silence that followed. The awkward pauses, the unanswered messages, the conversations that felt unfinished. Closure, she realized, is often a luxury of healthy dynamics. In unhealthy ones, clarity has to come from within. One of the most grounding practices Emily developed was checking in with her body instead of her thoughts. When she explained herself too much, her chest tightened. When she softened her boundary to relieve tension, she felt hollow. When she held steady, even though it was uncomfortable, her body eventually settled. That somatic feedback became more trustworthy than any external validation. Another critical part of holding the line was releasing the hope that consistency would eventually be rewarded with understanding. This was one of the hardest illusions to let go of. Emily wanted to believe that if she stayed calm long enough, kind enough, firm enough, Daniel would adapt. But boundaries are not bargaining chips. They are not leverage, they are not lessons, they are declarations of capacity. Emily came to see that whether Daniel adapted was not a measure of her effectiveness. It was a measure of his ability to relate to someone as a separate person. Holding the line also meant redefining what love looked like in practice. Love was no longer constant availability. It was not endless patience. It was not emotional self-sacrifice. Love became honesty without aggression, presence without fusion, care without control. This shift didn't make Emily colder, it made her clearer. She also learned to simplify her language. Long explanations had kept her entangled. Short, consistent statements created space. This doesn't work for me. I'm not willing to engage in that. I'm stepping back from this conversation. These sentences felt abrupt at first, almost rude, but over time she realized that clarity is only perceived as harsh by those who benefit from confusion. Holding the line without losing yourself also requires grieving the parts of you that once kept the peace. Emily had to acknowledge that her adaptability had once protected her. It had helped her feel loved, included, safe. Letting go of that strategy felt like letting go of armor. And yet armor is heavy. It restricts movement. It keeps you alive, but it doesn't let you breathe. As Emily held her boundary, she noticed something subtle but profound. She had more energy. Not immediately, but gradually. Energy that had once gone into monitoring tone, anticipating reactions, replaying conversations, now returned to her. She slept better. She felt more grounded. She trusted herself more. This is one of the quiet rewards of holding the line. You don't gain control over the other person, you regain access to yourself. There were moments when she doubted everything, moments when loneliness crept in, moments when she wondered if being alone would be worse than being diminished. But each time she imagined returning to the old dynamic, her body reacted with resistance. The thought felt heavier than the fear of the unknown. That became her answer. Holding the line is not about certainty. It is about alignment. Emily didn't know how the relationship would end. She didn't know whether Daniel would leave, change, or remain locked in resistance. What she knew was that crossing her own boundary again would cost her something she could no longer afford to lose: her sense of self. Holding the line also meant accepting that boundaries change the outcome of relationships. Some grow, some strain, some end. This is not failure, it is differentiation. Relationships that survive boundaries become more real. Relationships that collapse under them were never built on mutual respect. Emily stopped measuring success by whether the relationship improved. She measured it by whether she stayed intact. This is the part of boundary work that is rarely talked about. You don't feel empowered all the time. You feel exposed. You feel unsure. You feel deeply human. And that's the point. Boundaries are not about control, they are about truth. About letting relationships respond to who you actually are, not who you became to keep them comfortable. Holding the line means choosing the long path, the one that doesn't offer immediate relief but offers something far more valuable over time: integrity, wholeness, self-respect. Emily didn't become unrecognizable, she became more herself. And once that happened, she realized something quietly liberating. Even if everything else fell away, she would still be standing. Not rigid, not hardened, but rooted. That is how you keep boundaries without losing yourself. You stop trying to be someone others won't leave, and you become someone you don't abandon. The unexpected freedom on the other side of boundaries. On the other side of boundaries, there is a kind of freedom no one prepares you for. Not the loud kind, not the triumphant kind, not the kind that arrives with certainty or applause. It arrives quietly. Emily didn't wake up one morning feeling powerful or healed. She didn't feel victorious. There was no dramatic moment where everything made sense and the pain evaporated. What she felt instead was something far subtler and far more profound: space. For the first time in a long while, her mind wasn't constantly scanning for emotional shifts. Her body wasn't bracing for the next reaction. Her words weren't rehearsed in advance to minimize fallout. The tension she had mistaken for connection was gone, and in its absence something unfamiliar appeared. Silence that didn't feel threatening, time that didn't feel borrowed, choices that didn't require justification. This was the unexpected freedom. Boundaries don't immediately make life easier. In fact, they often make it harder at first. They strip away the structures that once told you who you were and how to behave. They remove the emotional scaffolding you leaned on, even when it hurt. But when that scaffolding falls, you finally see what has been holding you in place. Emily realized how much of her energy had gone into managing perceptions, anticipating Daniel's moods, adjusting her tone, softening truths, making herself legible in a way that would be least disruptive. She thought that was love. On the other side of boundaries, she discovered something different. Love without vigilance, connection without performance, presence without fear. The freedom wasn't about doing whatever she wanted. It wasn't about detachment or indifference. It was about no longer being internally occupied by someone else's emotional state. She could think again. She could feel her own reactions without immediately questioning them. She could experience anger without panic, sadness without shame, relief without guilt. That relief surprised her the most. Emily hadn't realized how heavy the emotional labor had been until she stopped carrying it. How much effort it took to remain available, agreeable, responsive at all times. How deeply she had internalized the belief that her worth was tied to how little space she took up. On the other side of boundaries, her inner world expanded. She noticed small things again: how her body felt in the morning, how her breath slowed when she wasn't rushing to respond, how her thoughts moved more freely when they weren't interrupted by anxiety. This freedom didn't come from controlling Daniel or winning an emotional standoff. It came from no longer organizing her life around his reactions. That distinction matters. True freedom is not power over someone else. It is sovereignty over yourself. Emily didn't suddenly stop caring. She didn't become hardened. She still felt compassion for Daniel. She still understood his pain. What changed was her relationship to responsibility. She no longer confused understanding with obligation. Daniel's feelings belonged to him. Her limits belonged to her. This separation allowed something else to emerge. Choice. Before boundaries, her actions were reflexive. She reacted. She accommodated. She adjusted. After boundaries, she began choosing. Choosing when to engage. Choosing when to step back. Choosing what conversations deserved her energy. Choice is the foundation of freedom. Emily also noticed that relationships around her began to change, not just the one with Daniel. Friends responded differently. Conversations felt more honest. Her presence felt less performative. Some connections deepened, others drifted away, and that too was part of the freedom. Boundaries don't preserve every relationship. They reveal which ones can exist without your self-erasure. They filter out dynamics that depend on your silence, your guilt, your overgiving. At first, that loss feels frightening, empty, like standing in an open field without walls. But over time, the emptiness becomes spaciousness. Emily no longer felt trapped in endless loops of explanation and repair. She no longer carried the weight of being misunderstood and trying to correct it. She stopped measuring her value by how well she could endure discomfort. On the other side of boundaries, she learned a radical truth. Peace is not something you earn by suffering well. It is something you allow by refusing to suffer unnecessarily. The most surprising freedom came in how she saw herself. For years, Emily had believed that strength meant resilience, being able to tolerate more, bend further, stay longer. Now she understood that strength could also mean discernment, knowing when enough is enough, knowing when love requires limits, knowing when staying costs more than leaving. This didn't make her fearless. It made her honest. There were still moments of doubt, moments when she wondered if she could have tried harder, said it better, been softer. Those thoughts didn't disappear, they simply lost their authority. She learned to let them pass without obeying them. Freedom, she realized, is not the absence of fear. It is the ability to move forward without letting fear dictate your choices. On the other side of boundaries, Emily also reclaimed her time. Time that had once been spent ruminating, explaining, waiting. She filled it with things that grounded her. Walks, writing, conversations that didn't require emotional translation. Her life became quieter, not emptier. And in that quiet, she felt more alive. She no longer needed constant reassurance that she was doing the right thing. The alignment she felt within herself became its own confirmation. When she honored her limits, she slept better. When she stayed true to herself, her body relaxed. This embodied sense of rightness became her new compass. The relationship with Daniel did not transform into something healthier, and that, too, was a form of clarity. Boundaries don't guarantee happy endings. They guarantee honest ones. Emily stopped waiting for closure from him. She stopped needing him to understand. Understanding, she learned, is not a prerequisite for freedom. Acceptance is. Acceptance that some people cannot meet you where you stand without you shrinking. Acceptance that love does not always look the way you hoped. Acceptance that your well-being matters even when others disagree. On the other side of boundaries, Emily no longer needed permission to exist as she was. She didn't need to justify her needs. She didn't need to defend her choices. She didn't need to explain her humanity. That is the freedom boundaries offer, not a life without pain, but a life without self-betrayal. In time, she began to trust herself in ways she never had before. not because she was always right, but because she knew she would listen to herself when something felt wrong. That trust was transformative. It changed how she entered new relationships, how she spoke up earlier, how she noticed red flags without rationalizing them away, how she honored her discomfort instead of overriding it. Boundaries had not made her less loving. They had made her more real. And the most unexpected freedom of all was this: Emily no longer feared losing people who required her to disappear. She understood that loneliness born of self-respect is far less painful than connection built on self-abandonment. She didn't feel superior. She didn't feel healed in a linear way. She felt grounded, present, whole. On the other side of boundaries, life didn't become perfect. It became honest. And honesty, lived consistently, quietly, without apology, turned out to be the most liberating thing she had ever known. Because once you experience what it feels like to live without constantly negotiating your worth, you realize something irreversible. You were never asking for too much. You were just asking the wrong people. And when you stop asking permission to be yourself, the world doesn't shrink. It opens. Emily's story is not dramatic in the way movies portray transformation. There is no single villain defeated, no triumphant speech, no moment where everything suddenly becomes clear and painless. Instead, her journey unfolds in the quiet, invisible places where most real change actually happens. Inside her thoughts, her body, and the small decisions she made when no one was watching. At the beginning of this story, Emily believed she was being loving by being flexible. She believed patience meant endurance, and understanding meant silence. Like many people, she had learned, slowly, subtly, over years, that harmony was something she had to earn by adjusting herself. She became skilled at reading emotional shifts, anticipating needs, and smoothing over tension before it had the chance to grow. This skill made her feel valuable, needed, safe, but it also made her disappear. Her relationship with Daniel didn't begin as something obviously harmful. It felt intense, meaningful, emotionally charged. That intensity masked a deeper imbalance. Emily was doing the emotional labor of regulation, while Daniel unconsciously relied on her to hold together what he could not manage on his own. Over time, Emily felt tired, confused, and quietly diminished, even though she couldn't point to a single catastrophic moment that explained why. The turning point wasn't a fight, it wasn't betrayal, it was a boundary. A simple moment of truth where Emily said, "This doesn't work for me." That sentence changed everything. What followed wasn't clarity or resolution, but resistance, confusion, guilt, emotional backlash. Emily learned, painfully, that boundaries don't just protect you. They expose the structure of the relationship you're in. What can survive your self-definition will grow stronger. What depends on your self-erasure will fight to restore the old order. Daniel's reactions were not random. They followed a pattern rooted in fear, not strength. His inability to tolerate Emily's separateness revealed something essential. He didn't experience her as a full, autonomous person. He experienced her as emotional access, regulation, stability. When that access was limited, it felt to him like abandonment. Understanding this did not excuse his behavior, but it helped Emily stop blaming herself. She learned that boundaries often feel cruel to people who benefit from you having none. She learned that guilt is not a moral signal. It is often a withdrawal symptom from self-abandonment. She learned that you can be compassionate without collapsing, loving without disappearing, present without being consumed. The hardest lesson was this: holding a boundary doesn't make things better right away. It often makes things worse before it makes anything honest. Emily had to tolerate discomfort without rushing to fix it. She had to sit with the fear of being misunderstood without defending herself. She had to grieve the version of the relationship she hoped might exist if she just tried harder. And she had to face the loneliness that comes when you stop playing a role others depended on. But slowly, something unexpected happened. She felt lighter, not because her life became easier, but because it became truer. The mental noise quieted. The constant emotional vigilance faded. Her energy returned. She could think, feel, and choose without filtering every reaction through someone else's comfort. On the other side of boundaries, Emily didn't find perfection. She found freedom. Not the freedom to do whatever she wanted, but the freedom to exist without negotiating her worth. The freedom to trust her inner signals, the freedom to choose connection without obligation, the freedom to let relationships reveal themselves instead of forcing them to work. And perhaps most importantly, she found herself. The lesson in Emily's story is not that narcissistic people are villains or that boundaries magically fix everything. The deeper lesson is this: relationships are not tests of how much you can endure. They are reflections of how well you are allowed to exist as yourself. If a relationship requires you to be smaller, quieter, or endlessly accommodating in order to survive, the cost is not love, it is identity. Boundaries are not walls, they are doors with hinges. They allow connection that is chosen, not extracted. They teach others how to treat you, but more importantly, they teach you how to treat yourself. For those watching or listening who see themselves in Emily, the application to real life begins with one honest question. Where am I abandoning myself to keep someone else comfortable? It might show up as over-explaining, as ignoring your body's signals, as staying silent when something hurts, as feeling guilty for having needs, as telling yourself it's not that bad when something inside you knows it is. You don't have to set every boundary today. You don't have to confront anyone dramatically. Real change often starts quietly, with noticing, with pausing, with choosing not to override yourself one more time. Boundaries don't ask you to be fearless. They ask you to be truthful, and truth practiced consistently reshapes your life. Before we end, Braun, here's a quick question for you to reflect on and answer in the comments. Question: when someone reacts strongly to your boundary, what do you believe it usually means? A. You did something wrong. B. You touched something that matters. Comment A or B below and let us know why you chose that answer. And now, we'd love to hear from you. What part of Emily's story resonated most with you? Have you experienced a moment where setting a boundary changed how you saw a relationship or yourself? Share your thoughts and perspectives in the comments so others can learn from your experience too. If this story helped you see boundaries in a new way, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue creating thoughtful, meaningful content that explores healing, self-respect, and emotional truth. Thank you for being here and for choosing to listen to this story and to yourself.